So on these next few slides, I'm going to be going over with you guys how x-rays look different when we change either the kVp or the MAS. So we're going to be looking at the first ones here at variable kVp x-rays where the MAS was always constant. These are the three x-rays I'm going to be going through with you guys. On all three of these, the MAS was always 2.5. MAS didn't change. The number of x-rays hitting the film didn't change. That was constant. But the kVp did change. The first one we'll be looking at has a kVp of 40. The next one we'll look at has a kVp of 60. And the last one has a kVp of 80. You guys can probably already see some mild changes on these. Next few slides here, I'm going to go through for you guys these in more detail. So this slide here is the same one we were just looking at. You can see this one has the kVp of 40. So that's what we're looking at on this slide. The two things we're going to focus on are the step wedge, which is right over here, and the skull. So focusing on those two things, that's what we will be talking about. So let's start with the step wedge. This is that thick piece of metal, very thick on one side, very thin on the other. So in a stepwise fashion, it goes from thin metal to thick metal. So here we had a 40 kVp, a relatively low force of kVp hitting it. And right over here is where we have our thinnest portion of metal of the step wedge. So if we look at this and kind of count how many steps we can see, I can probably see 1, 2, 3, and then these kind of all blend together. So we cannot see too many steps. We had a pretty low force. We had enough force to get through these first few steps. But the time we got up here, we just didn't have enough force. So all you see is something that looks white. If we flip over and we look at the skull, over here in the skull area, we can see a lot of white areas. Things look pretty white, pretty white, pretty white. In fact, there's really no black. The only black I can see at all are kind of up here in the nasal cavities. But otherwise, this x-ray is really light. It didn't have a lot of force, so a lot of these x-rays got absorbed within the skull, and not that many of them hit the image receptor. Now, with this x-ray here, we've moved up to our kVp of 60. So we've increased our force. Remember, MAS is the same exact number of x-rays hit this as they did previously. We just used more force. So here we have this exact same step wedge. And if we look at this one, we can count quite a few steps, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I can count at least 9 steps before they sort of wash out into a sea of white. So we had a lot more force, so we can see a lot more definition in these steps. Here we had enough force to get all the way through up here. Back when we did only the 40, we were kind of stuck about here on these steps. More force, more x-rays got through, we were able to get through thicker structures. More x-rays are going to hit the image receptor, and we're going to have a darker looking x-ray like you can see up on this one. So here, if we look up at the skull, we're going to see a lot more blackness on this x-ray than we did before. Throughout all of these areas, things that were bright white before are now becoming a darker color. So now on this particular x-ray, we went all the way up to 80 kVp. Kept that MAS the same, but now up to 80. Now on this one, let's start just looking at this skull. This skull, it's super black. Like, even the thickest areas of the skull now look gray. We don't see any white on this x-ray. It's like dark gray, maybe a few light grays, and black. A lot of force. Pretty much all of these x-rays went through what we were x-raying. They hit the image receptor, and we see a really black looking image. Now if we come down here and we look at our step wedge, here is where we have our thinnest area of the step wedge, and up here is where we have our thickest. So now when we get up to our thick area of the step wedge, we can start seeing the individual steps in the thicker area. But if we look back down here at sort of our first step, where number 1 would be, it's almost burned through. You almost can't see it. And these steps in here are much, much darker than they've been in the previous x-rays. So here are these x-rays again. This was our 40 kVp, our 60, and our 80. So the same x-rays we just looked at, but here they are all in one. So hopefully you guys can kind of see, if we look at the step wedge, just how much different it looks at 40, where we can only see the first few, and then it's all white. Here we can see almost all of them before we start to lose it. And here it's really dark at the beginning, then we can see a lot of good ones, but we can actually see all the way through the thickest ones. And if you look at the skull, here we have a very white skull. We increased our force down here again. You can see how quickly the skull goes from something nice and bright white, a lot of more darker shades of gray, to something that's almost completely black. So this is what's happening when we're just changing our force. Same number of x-rays hit all these, we just changed the penetration power, the kVp, the force that those x-rays were coming out of the machine with.